I invite you to turn to Hebrews chapter 11. That'll be our text this morning. Hebrews chapter 11. Sing to me of heaven. We'll sing that, and we say during that song it'll bring release from the toils that endure us in life, that bind us in life. And we say the things that we were just singing about heaven, believing in heaven, that it will lift the burdens that are pressing. We sang about and contemplated the reality of heaven showering of great blessings that will flow. And all these ideas, I believe that's true if we truly believe in heaven. And that's what we're going to see as we study together this morning. The text this morning has to do with heaven. And so as we seek out to understand what that is, we're going to look at Abraham in the study of Abraham this morning. That we find a statement in Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse number 10. Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 10, where it says, "For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God." So we're just simply going to look at that specific phrase this morning, looking for the city. Now, as we begin, I want to just note a couple of things of importance. And one is that looking for something has some different ways that we may think about that. You may look for, as you're driving on the road and you come to construction, you may look for an alternate route as to how you might get around construction and enable yourself to go from one place to the next, maybe a little more conveniently. But you may also look for in a different way, not searching to find, but to look in an expectant manner. Like a wife may look for her husband to come home from work. She has an expectancy of him coming home from work, that he will return, and she might tell him, I am looking forward to when you get home from work today. And so she's wanting or waiting expectantly for him to return. I think that's the idea here in this text that we see. That Abraham was looking expectantly, not in the sense of just searching to find. Now look back at the end of verse 8 to kind of see that idea. He was called earlier in verse 8, he talks about to go to a land that God would show him. And so he went out not knowing where he was going. So that's the idea of searching to find. And so that's not what's meant then in chapter 11 and verse 10. This city, he's talking about in verse 10, he did know where he was going in the wandering, but he doesn't have this idea of searching to find. He's wanting expectingly in this. And this is the idea, the theme throughout, actually. That there are people in chapter 11 that are used as examples of people who live by faith. They live by faith expectingly. And so in the face of trials and discouragement. Notice verse 1 of chapter 11. It says, "Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." Now, when it says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, we don't want to take that as something that rests objectively on us believing it. That's what the world would think and accuse us of. And so that is that heaven is just sort of this pie in the sky sort of idea, and if you want to believe in it, okay, but it's all just resting upon you believing it and you thinking that it's there, and your belief is what keeps it in existence. That's the sort of way of thinking. That's not what this verse is talking about. That's not what this is saying about the faith of Abraham or anyone else in this specific chapter. What this verse is saying is that there is a reality of heaven. But unless you believe it, you won't have any assurance of it. That's the idea there in verse 1. It's a subjective, it's outside of you, a subjective foundation and substance of what we hope for and believing in the faithfulness of God, the power of God, and the love of God. It's what enables Abraham, as we're going to read through the text, to have a confidence about a place that he had not seen. It's what enables him to have a hope to go there. When we talk about hope, we think of hope as a wish. But the Bible doesn't use hope in that way. It uses hope as a confident expectation. And so defining these words helps us understand what's going on here. if we have a confident expectation that when this life is over, we're going to go to a place that we just sang about, we're going to have this kind of faith then that's described in Hebrews chapter 11. The key verse is verse 6, really. It's a key verse to the whole chapter. He talks about the very faith that sustains this kind of expectation, this kind of hope. He says, without faith, it is impossible to please Him. And so, for he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. There's two things here in this verse. One, you must believe that He is. That's one thing. But it's not enough. That's not all the totality of what he's saying. Believing in God will not give you this hope that's talked about here in the chapter. It wouldn't have caused Abraham to look for a city, but that also He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. Abraham was seeking God. He lived in a world that was full of idolatry and ignorance. He was a man who sought to know, he sought to serve, he sought to worship the one true living God and to find favor and to honor Him. He believed with his heart that God would reward him. Not just that God is, but He's a rewarder of those who diligently seek after Him. He was looking for a city. He was expecting, waitingly for God to keep His promise of a better place and better time. Look in verse 9. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise. Notice that word, promise. As in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. Verse 11. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Verse 13. All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. All throughout here he's talking about this promise. This is a promise that Abraham believed in the promises of God, that he was looking for a city that he would inherit by the promises of Almighty God. That's what he's talking about here in the text. Look in verse 10 as we dive a little deeper. He says he was looking for the city. Notice it says he was looking for the city. You see that? I know the King James, New King James puts a there, but I will caution that there is an article there for the. So, now you say, well, it's not in mine. It just says a city. Okay. But we can derive from what the rest of the verse says and know that this is not just any city. This is something special. You don't have to know anything about the article there for the or a or anything like that to know it's special, because he defines it, what he's talking about. He defines that it's special. He says whose architect and builder is God. It is a special city which has foundations. And in verse 9 he says, by faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. You know, Abraham is a rich man. Now, how many rich people do you know today that live in tents and travel around and wander around just living in a tent? I'm not talking about an RV. I'm talking about living in a tent. That's what he's talking about here. And how many people started that journey of living in tents when they were about 75 and lived in those tents and were doing that until they died, but they were plenty wealthy and rich to go and have the nicest of house. You see, that's the idea here, because he, that is Abraham, believed that God had this promise and he was going to honor God and what God was going to say. He lived in various places. He goes to the land of Canaan. He pitched his tent near Bethel. He went down to Egypt, and he came back to the land of Canaan near Bethel again. And he went to Hebron. He went to various places and moved his abode around. That's what he's talking about here when he talks about it. But it says that Abraham was looking for something permanent. He was looking for the city which has foundations. That is a city in which he would never have to pitch his tent again. He wouldn't have to move around anymore. And so this would be this place that he would be forever. A city which has foundations. I think Matthew 7 and Matthew 16 kind of help get this figure, so I'm going to use them real fast. Matthew chapter 7 is the first one, and we're coming back to Hebrews chapter 11, but Matthew chapter 7, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about to these listeners, which should be all kingdom citizens, about how to receive these words that he was teaching to them. And so he uses an analogy that helps them understand, and I think it'll help us understand Hebrews chapter 11 too. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 24. Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. So Jesus' lesson was, you listen to what I'm teaching, but listening to what I'm teaching comes with it a responsibility to do the things that I'm teaching you to do. And if you'll listen to that and act on it, it's the way he uses it in verse 24, and you'll take that and build your life on it, and it's the foundation for which all is built on, you'll never be sorry. You'll never be sorry like the one who built his house on the sand. No, there won't come something that'll disappoint you, because you'll understand what life truly is all about in the big picture. You build upon what Jesus says and do what he says. He says you'll be building a solid future for yourself. And that's the truth about Jesus Christ. You see that imagery of building on the rock instead of building on the sand. Now, some people will spend their entire lives building on the sand, only to have their hopes dashed. And Abraham's looking for a city which has foundations. As you turn to chapter 16 of Matthew, it'd be sad if Abraham spent his time looking for this city, and then he died. He finds out, it's all a dream. It's just something that it wasn't there. That's not the way that it's put. This city has foundations. It's permanent. In Matthew 16, Jesus talks to his disciples, and he asked them in verse 13, who do people say the Son of Man is? And people give different views about that. And so that's the point he's making about it, as to who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, says, you're the Christ, Son of the living God. But he makes the connection back down in verse 18, where he says, I say to you that you are Peter. Upon this rock I will build my church. Gates of Hades not overpower it. But notice verse 18 at the beginning of the verse. He says, upon this rock. He draws a comparison. What is he talking about? Well, there's a comparison back to verse 13. In verse 13, Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi. So what can we use to make an application? Well, rock. Well, what does that mean? Well, the city of Caesarea Philippi in this district, they would build cities upon rocks because it would give a firm foundation and it would protect them from attacks and those sort of things. And the idea here in verse 18 is there's a bedrock. And so there's something here that's stable, something that gives a firm foundation. What gives the firm foundation? It's the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, verse 16. That's the firm foundation. That's the rock of which this can be built upon. And it endures because it has a good foundation. The best. Satan can try whatever he wants to. He can try to destroy it, but it will not happen. You see that there at the end of the text in verse 18. He says the gates of Hades cannot prevail against the truth. Why? It's founded on the rock. And so, to understand this solid foundation, we sing songs about this based on the truth that has this foundation. We talk about we won't be disappointed. And so you see that imagery of these solid foundations as Jesus uses them. And we take that back to our text in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 10, and we see something about what he means. And so it is, he looked for the city, looking for the city which has foundations. It's firm. It's the bedrock then. And it doesn't matter how long it is until the Lord returns. This is a city which has foundations. It's not going to crumble. It's not going to fall apart. You can stake your life upon these truths. The end of verse 10 in our text says, whose architect and builder is God. What kind of city is that? Well, that's something special. Whose architect and builder is God. It's a special city. Verse 16 kind of describes it even more. It says, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God's not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. What is this city? Well, it's a heavenly one, whose architect and builder is God. And you see something else, verse 16. This city's not just for anyone. It's not just any that would come, but a city for a people who are in a special relationship with God. He will be their God. He will protect them. He will sustain them. And they will worship Him. Now, we can think there's not going to be any there that don't believe in God. And there won't be any there in that city who don't want to do what God wants them to do according to His will. He will prepare a place for those people who are His people, who want to live according to His will, and they want to share a relationship with God. He says, these are my people that will be there in that city. This is the city he's talking about, whose builder and architect is God. It's a heavenly one. You see that as well there in verse 16. He says, that is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Same idea back up in verse 9 by comparison. He lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land. Abraham lived a long time in Canaan. But he says he lived as an alien in a foreign land. You think about that. That God makes this promise to Abraham about this land He's going to give him, and yet he doesn't get any of that. The way that Stephen preaches about it in Acts chapter 7 and verse 5, and I'm not going to read much into Stephen's sermon, but just verse 5 as a note. It says, he gave him no inheritance. How much? Just a little, right? I mean, he went to Canaan and got a little. No, it says not even a foot of ground. He didn't get any of that. So how is it that this is understanding of this promise, that it's not physical in this physical Canaan that's his own possession, not any land or not any dirt. In chapter 11 here of Hebrews in verse 13, he died in faith. All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed they were strangers and exiles on the earth. It wasn't Canaan that was on Abraham's mind. As he's living and traveling and moving that tent and all that sort of stuff, it wasn't that Abraham said that Canaan, that's what God's fulfillment of His promise is. That's what's on it. No. It's not just Canaan. And it's not just Abraham that needs to understand this either. All of us need to understand that we're just here for a little while. We're just journeying here. We're just strangers here. We sing it like this sometimes. We sing songs about heaven. This world's not my home. I'm just a passing through. We sing that, and here's the idea that Abraham would join in singing with us in that song. He might say, Canaan's not my home. I'm looking for the city that's built with God's purpose in mind, built for God's people, a heavenly city, a special city. And on this earth, I'm nothing but a stranger and a pilgrim, because that city is for God's special people, that almighty God that has a special relationship with these people. That's this special city. It's further emphasized here in the text in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 14. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. A country of their own. You could translate this phrase, land of our fathers, and that's the idea of fatherland. And so a country of their own, we kind of get a glimpse of a fatherland concept sometimes. Because we say it a little different. We would say, I want to go back to my homeland. I want to go back home. And what we mean by that is probably that it's where we were raised as a kid, and so that's what we are most familiar with, the kind of the social norms, the culture norms, and maybe Maybe it is when we talk of it like that, we think about shared values or shared priorities or that kind of thing. But yet, that's not it here. Because you see, on earth, he says he's a stranger and an exile. So when he's talking about this country of their own or this homeland, he's talking about something different. Maybe if I can make this connection for us. Do the people that you work with and that you're around every day share your views? Do they share your priorities, your hopes, and your dreams? We would probably say no. There's a country, though, that Abraham was looking for. A country of their own. But wait, this adds even more complexity to it, because we sometimes think of a country of their own and a homeland, and we think about fathers and the fatherland, and so we start thinking about genealogy. And we start thinking about history, but there's a problem with that, and why we can't make that fit into the context. Abraham was the first Hebrew. You work that family tree back, and you say, I'm trying to trace back the Hebrews. He's looking for a country of his own. And yet the idea of being a Hebrew starts with him. So it's not based on lineage. It's not based on physicality of fleshly ties to Jacob and Israel. He's looking for a country of his own. And that's in contrast. Look at verse 9. He says, by faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land. And at the end of verse 13, he says, having confessed they were strangers and exiles on the earth. He's looking for a place that feels comfortable. He's looking for a place where people are the kind of people that he is. That is, people that worship the God that he worships, that worship Almighty God, that share the priorities that he has. He's looking for a city, but it wasn't on the earth. It wasn't a city in Canaan that Abraham was looking for. There's this city and there's this city and all that. No, it's that. He's talking about something special. A country of his own is, and if we make it, I kind of hesitate to say it like that, but if we make it to this city that Abraham's talking about, you come across different people in the chapter that would be there. Maybe Abraham would be one you might think about. One that goes about and lives as a journeyman from place to place because God gives him his instructions and he just follows through with what God says. Or maybe you'll meet another man there that offered a sacrifice of understanding to God. And it was pleasing to God, but yet his brother murdered him out of jealousy in Abel. One that sought to serve God amongst that situation. Or maybe you would meet Enoch, as talked about in Hebrews chapter 11. A man that didn't taste death in an ungodly society, that he was able to serve God with ungodliness all around him. Men and women that persevered throughout difficulties, who were looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. Verse 24. Maybe it's Moses. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw how beautiful a child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. You know, Moses, in verse 24, it says, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. You ever wonder why? Surely we have, because growing up as a prince in Egypt would have all of the worldly benefits that maybe we would think we would want. Nicest house in the country. All the access to all the delicacies that life could give you physically, wealth, riches, comfort. Everything that comes with living in the king's palace and the Pharaoh's palace. But what motivated him? What motivated him that he could look at his countrymen, the slaves that were in bondage, and knowing the difficulty that they entailed and knowing what was facing them, that he would instead cast his lot with them? In verse 24, when he had grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin. And if we weigh that on the scales and on the balance, and we say all the passing pleasures that would be in living in Pharaoh's house as a son of Pharaoh's daughter compared to living out with the slaves and the ill treatment, we'd say he doesn't make a very good choice. But there's sin on one hand, and then on the other hand, there's being maligned and mistreated and running for your lives and the threat of death. And he chooses this side. He chooses, I'm going to suffer the ill treatment rather than the passing pleasures of sin. Why? Verse 26. Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. How many of us would have made the same choice? How many of us would have recognized what it really was all about? Wouldn't you love to live in a town where everybody had this same priority about serving God? That wanted that was all sought to be pleasing to God and were His people. And that's what Abraham is looking for, a country of his own, a land of our fathers. And so people there that are God's people. People that God would not be ashamed of. That He would be proud to say, these are my people. I want a marker there and turn back to Philippians chapter 3, please. Philippians chapter 3. You know Paul's in prison. This is one of the prison epistles. And there's some debate about how long he spent in prison, but he had been about 30 years as an apostle after he had come to the knowledge that Jesus was the Christ, and he submitted himself to that and submitted himself to what God's will was. And during those 30 years where he served, he talks about all the difficulties that he had, where he was stoned and whipped and humiliated, and his life was full of turmoil. But in Philippians chapter 3 and in verse 17 it says, "Brethren, join in following my example." Now I'll pause that the example here is not the persecution. It's not that difficulty, but the previous verses. That is wanting to be what Christ laid hold of him for. That's the text. So as reaching for the goal that Christ had for him. Join in following my example. And observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. You see, he's saying, you seek to follow the example of serving God, and you cling to others that are wanting to do the very same thing. Now, they're wanting to do the very same thing despite what might happen to them. And so difficulties may arise. A Christian that may look and say, serving God is of the utmost importance to me. I have to change my job because the one I have doesn't align with and allow me to serve God as I should. So I have to change job. Maybe it pays less than the other. What's most important? Or they say being a Christian means that I'm going to have family problems, but I'm going to be a Christian anyway, and I'm going to serve God anyway. Or being a Christian means that I'm going to be unpopular amongst my peers. Maybe amongst my peers at school, or maybe amongst my peers at work, and so be it. I'll be unpopular then. Because serving God is of the utmost importance. The way that Paul describes it is he talks about these things as rubbish in order to know Christ. In order to lay hold of Him. To lay hold of what God wanted for him and be in service to the risen Master. That doesn't describe us. Can we at least say we know someone that's willing to make that understanding of life? That there are people that we mix and mingle with all the time that are looking for the same city that Abraham was looking for. Just a few chapters after our text, in chapter 13 of Hebrews, and verse 7, it kind of gives us an idea about who he's writing to. This and another text we'll look at in a minute. But he tells them, the writer says, "Remember those who led you," Hebrews 13:7, "who spoke the word of God to you, and consider the result of their conduct. Imitate their faith." This chapter we're looking at in Hebrews chapter 11 is the example to us to imitate these people that have gone down this path before. They've lived this life of faith. That the end of this life is looking forward to what God has prepared. A country of their own, as he's put it here in this text. A city that God built for His people, which has foundations. That's what Abraham was looking for. Back to our text in chapter 11. I've skipped a couple verses. Let's pick them up in the middle here. Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to look at 15 and 16. And I want you to notice this. It doesn't equate everything I want it to on the point, but I want you to notice three words, really. The if, the but, and the therefore. So verses 15 and 16, just look for those and what's connected between them. Okay? Hebrews 11:15. Indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. So let's look at those three ideas that he makes there in those verses. The first one in verse 15, if they had been thinking. The idea is if they had habitually remembered it. And that's the idea that he's talking about. If Abraham looked at his travels and he said, I had it better back there at Ur. Before I started all this travel, I had it back there. I had it better. I had the conveniences of life. I had all this good stuff back there that I could enjoy. And now I got to spend the rest of my life traveling around and living in these tents. If every time he was traveling from place to place, he said, boy, I tell you what, I'm in the heat of the desert. Boy, it sure was better back in Ur before I left. Every time you had to go draw water or find something like that, boy, back in Ur, it was so much better. The writer here saying that if that was the way that he was thinking, he could have went back. If. That means Abraham had a choice, doesn't it? He was a free moral agent. Brethren, we have a choice. God does not make you live for Him. God does not make you have the right priorities. It is your choice how you're going to live and the priorities you're going to have. And if all we can think about as a Christian is, boy, before I was a Christian, I had it so much better back over there. Things were so much more fun or whatever it might be. We're following the same path. If that's all you can think about, go do it. God will not make you serve Him. If you're longing for those things, you haven't changed your mind in order to come to serve God. He's talking about people who have made a commitment to serving God. And it's not saying I'm looking back and longing for it before I was a Christian, but a people that are serving God, believing in Him, and believing that He is a rewarder of those who actively seek Him. While you have opportunity and while I have opportunity, I have a choice to make. And the choice that I have to make is what I'm going to set my eyes on to determine to be God's person. If you don't want to be God's person, you're not going to be in this city that he's talking about. You'll spoil it. If this isn't a concern to you, it won't be. But a person that God's not ashamed of, not ashamed to be called your God, He will have a place for you in that city. Turn back to chapter 10. One of the passages helps us understand the people that it were written to and the difficulties they had and the circumstances. In chapter 10 and verse 32, he says, remember the former days, when after being enlightened you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle, through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property. Would you just pause it? Would you accept joyfully the seizure of your property? Would you be good with that? Would you associate with these people and throw them in jail? You know, I guess we could put 34A in here as kind of a subnote. And just, put in and say, but if you don't want to endure hardships, then just hide your faith. Just keep it quiet, keep it on the down low. Blasphemy. No. Look at the rest of the verse here. Knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. There's a better possession, or an abiding one, that's the way he puts it. That's what we're thinking about in chapter 11. That's what we're thinking about here. They're talking about times are rough. In verse 35, therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. You think about that person going to be part of the city that shrinks back? No. Verse 39, we're not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. All kinds of difficulties we may find ourselves in. Maybe difficulties at work, maybe difficulties at school, maybe financial difficulties. But if we believe that God is, and we believe that God is a rewarder of those who seek after Him, it will be worth it all. You find Luke writes about in Luke chapter 12, records for us this parable in Luke chapter 12 and verse 16, where Jesus tells a parable about the land of a rich man who was very productive. So you would think as you turn to Luke chapter 12 that this man is living in just good times, no suffering, he's not hungry, he's just having a great time. And yet in verse 17 he says, he began to reason to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? And then he said, this is what I will do. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I'll say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So that he's living for the here and now. He's living for the good times here and now. Verse 20, God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? You know what that is? This is a guy that doesn't have any foundation. In verse 21, so is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. The discussion that Jesus is having here, as you read the context, is he's encouraging them to seek first the kingdom of God and don't seek after the things that the Gentiles seek after. You know who had attitudes like that? Abraham, Moses, Paul, many that we could go through. They were looking for the city. Oh, they dealt with difficulties here. They dealt with persecution and trouble here, but they were looking for a country of their own. Although they had a choice. Paul had a choice. He could have chosen to live life in the easy way of just doing what he was doing and go about it that way. But they chose instead that they were going to live a life in continued devotion to God and to be with Him. In the parable of the sower in Mark's account, in Mark chapter 4, he talks about the seed being sown, and the seed fell on different kinds of soil, and he explains the analogy then about the thorns. And Jesus says in chapter 4 and in verse 19, the worries of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. That's the jobs, that's the careers, that's the games, that's entertainment, that's families, all that sort of stuff. If we're focused on that stuff, we're not looking for the city. If we're worried about the here and now, we're not looking for what God says we should be focused on. And then somehow we think, maybe I'll just slip in under the gate. You're not going to accidentally get into heaven, friends. It's not something that is just going to be, well, there it is. And I didn't plan to get here, but here I am. I didn't put any effort into it, but here I am. These people were looking for the city. And so, back to our text in Hebrews chapter 11, you have a choice, and I have a choice. But, he says in verse 16, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. They made a choice. Abraham desired more than there was in the land of Canaan, a better country. What kind? A heavenly one. And that was his choice. And what can help a person make that same choice is faith. That's back in verse 1. He believed in God, and he believed that God was a rewarder of those who diligently seek after Him. Therefore, verse 16, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. Well, what about you and me? Is it do the will of if, do the choice game, or do we desire something greater? Are we seeking after God? Are we seeking to have God say our name? That He will say of me, I'm not ashamed of Coy. That He's my people. Will God view me in that way? Or will He say, well, he's materialistic? He's worldly. He's not devoted to serving me. I don't want him in my city. Which of those reactions are what we want to be focused on by God? My Savior, pardon me. And now I onward go. I know He'll make it through, though I'm weak and poor. I can't feel at home in this world anymore. We sing that. We think about those words and we sing songs about heaven. And what a blessing it is to sing to me of heaven. But do we understand what God's expectation is and the joy and the majesty of what He's prepared for us? I mean, chapter 10, the end of chapter 10 and verse 36, he says we have need of endurance. Why? Well, I don't know how long I'm going to live. Well, I don't know how long I'm going to live here. I don't know what temptations are going to be put in my way, what difficulties or what prosperity. And so I have need of endurance so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. So you got to keep on keeping on. You got to keep looking for the city. You got to keep making the choice. You got to keep your priorities. Seeking after God, chapter 11 and verse 6. And you know chapter 12 continues the thought. Chapter 12 and verse 1, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, that is, all these people of faith from chapter 11. And he comes to the pinnacle, the greatest example of all. You have all these people that in chapter 11 who are watching, and they're watching, and they see us down here running this race, and we're hot and tired and all that sort of stuff. But they say, we've run the race before. It says, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. We get distracted. And we can say, oh, it's so hard. He says, let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. I think the idea of what he's talking about here is faith. You keep your faith in running this race, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. There's no better example, no greater encouragement than Jesus Christ himself. When he left heaven, and he came, he was to be born of a virgin, born a human, one of his own creation. And he knew he would be subject to what humans are subject to. And yet, he would be maligned. People would treat him poorly. Even his own family wouldn't understand, and people would want to kill him. And he did all that knowing that he would be nailed to the cross and suffering that would entail. And notice what it says at the end of verse 2, he says, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. He was looking beyond. Abraham could see beyond Canaan, looking for the city. Jesus could see beyond the cross. And so if we want to be with him, we want to be among those who he died for. If we want to be part of the country that's made up of his people, and we've got to find ourselves seeking after him. We've got to confess his name and live our life confessing his name, as we talked about in class this morning. Be buried in the waters of baptism, and then live a life of true commitment to his will. We can't let anything deter us in that focus of our life. We've got to keep looking for the city. We can help you on that journey this morning in a public manner. Let us know as we stand and as we sing.